A brief history of the tritone. For reference, a tritone is when you have either an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, and it's called a tritone because it splits the octave exactly in half, at least depending on how it's written. And for reference, here is how a tritone would sound in a diatonic C scale. Pretty dissonant, right? And that's why medieval music theorists and composers sought to avoid the tritone as much as possible, believing it was the devil's interval, because it is just the most out-of-tune interval that we have available to us in our 12-tone system. So, they would find ways of avoiding it by either, in terms of polyphony, that is, by either just not moving certain lines while other lines ascended or descended, or kind of breaking the rules of the diatonic scale a little bit and moving certain notes down a little bit to kind of avoid that tritone. Now, as centuries went by, composers would start to kind of branch out a little more, and so you'd have instances where we'd use tritones to evoke certain things like Jesus fighting a dragon, real piece of music. And then, in the Baroque period, we have the start of tonality. And that is when we are focusing on keys and the tonic and the motion of the 5 to the 1, the dominant to the tonic. And here is where tritones would start to become more acceptable in harmony, because composers found that tritones in harmony would do a really good job of emphasizing the importance of the tonic. So, for example, using a diminished 7th chord to go to a major 1 chord or minor 1 chord, or using not just a 5 chord going to a 1 chord, but rather a 5-7 chord going to a 1 chord, because in a 5-7 chord you have that dominant 7th, which creates a tritone between the dominant 7th and the 3rd of the 5-7 chord. But in part writing, in voice leading, that was still a no-no. No tritones. Except for when they did, but whatever. And in general, you wouldn't want to modulate to the tritone of your tonic key as well. But in the 19th century, as composers started to branch out more, especially after Beethoven, then we start having tritones become more acceptable, and especially with the rise of things like programmatic music with Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner, especially pushing the whole Tristan chord thing with how that resolves, or how it doesn't resolve really. And then we have, coming along, Claude Debussy, who basically said, yeah, I don't get why certain chords and dissonances have to be resolved in certain ways. And so that basically brought us the end of the Common Practice period with musical impressionism and all the kinds of dissonances and melodic structures that would play with in tritones, but not just tritones, but also whole tone scales and octatonic scales. And then in the 20th century, we get, of course, atonality with Schoenberg, and that's just, tritones and dissonances galore. And then we start to have people like Benjamin Britten using tritones to demonstrate the irony of war, or Oliver Messiaen using tritones to demonstrate the negation of desire and contemplation. And so that's basically the tritone in a nutshell. Like and follow for more.